All right, here we are, week 11, the last of the Middle Ages tonight. So 11 weeks, that's 16 and a half hours. If you've been to every class, 16 and a half hours, or if you watched it on video, 16 and a half hours of church history since the beginning. So last week we talked about all the socioeconomic, all the socio-political changes of the late Middle Ages. And for our last week now, we're going to just talk about folks like us, the lay people. No monks, no priests, no nuns, no bishops, no popes, nothing tonight, just lay people. So we're going to just finish up the late Middle Ages tonight. And again, that's that 200-year period from 1300 to 1500. And what we're going to see tonight is it actually started back in the century before this, back in about 1200, but we're going to see from about 1200 to 1500, this waves of renewal of spirituality among lay people. And this is happening when all those troubling things are happening in Europe in the late Middle Ages, this intense spirituality of lay people. And it's this renewal of a vibrant devotional life of loving Jesus, and to an extent that had never been seen before through the Middle Ages at the level of the lay people. So for hundreds of years in the Middle Ages, the common people worked long hours, didn't earn much money. They were serfs and peasants. They weren't typically able to read or write. Copies of the Bible were virtually unavailable to anybody except inside of a church. And monks and nuns had access to the Bible and to education, but the lay people didn't have either of those things. But things start to change, like I said, around 1200. And it's so different from what it was before. It's really, almost only explainable by a move of the Spirit of God. So, and this is a picture from an altar, one piece from a painting from an altar piece that was done in this same time period. So devout monks and hermits started to come out of seclusion and preach in villages and cities across Europe. And they preached in the language of the people so that the people could understand them. And they called lay people and even clergy to repent and enter into a genuine relationship with the Lord, which ultimately led to intimate oneness with Christ. And this spiritual progress, which would culminate in inner mystical union with Christ, became known as mysticism. And we're going to meet three mystics at the end of tonight. So first by the thousands and then by the tens of thousands, lay people responded. And they were thirsty for a really true and vital Christian life. And they joined various movements that offered them the opportunity to grow spiritually. So we see this 300 years of remarkable waves of spiritual renewal across Western Europe. And I'd like to look at this lay spirituality, this mysticism, by the way of a case study. I'm going to take this one case study for quite a while tonight, because she's a tremendous example of all the various elements of the spirituality that we see in this time period. And her name is Marjorie Kemp. And she was born in 1373 and lived till 1438. And she was born in Norfolk, England, to one of those merchant middle-class families. And she married a merchant named John Kemp, and they had 14 children. So she's married with children, like a lot of us. In her younger years, and if you heard my sermon on Sunday, I mentioned Marjorie Kemp. But in her younger years, she was respectful of the church. And like everybody else, she went to Mass. She went to confession. She took the Eucharist. She fasted. She prayed her rosary. She gave alms or money to charity. but she wanted something more. And in her 20s, she began having visions in which she talked to, on a friendly basis, to Jesus and Mary and some saints. And in one vision, Jesus told her that her religious practices, although they were good, they were for beginners, and that Marjorie should go deeper. So she went, for the rest of her life, she was on this quest to come closer and closer in union with Christ. At about age 60, she dictated her story to some scribes. They put it together, and it became the first autobiography written in the English language. So this is the book of Marjorie Kemp. That's her story. This is my copy of it. Pretty fascinating, but I'm just going to give some highlights that illustrate the spirituality of the time. Okay. So one of the changes that fed Marjorie's spiritual experience and people of that time was, quote unquote, a rediscovery of the Gospels. Interestingly, between 500 and 900, in those dark ages, that early Middle Ages, the Old Testament was really big in religious consciousness, and it inspired their early medieval clergy to use incense and in worship, and to anoint people with oil, and encourage tithing and strict observance of the Sabbath, all these things from the Old Testament. And even in the New Testament was read through those warlike cultures. And we talked about this a little bit, how they viewed Jesus. And in the early medieval imagination, Jesus was thought of as the stern judge or the hero. And these two images on the left here are from an earlier time period than we're talking about now. So here's at the top, kind of like Jesus, the stern judge. And down here we have Jesus as a hero. He's stepping on the snake's head, on a lion, but he's not even on the cross, he's carrying it. But after the Viking invasions had kind of settled down, and the warrior tribes have been Christianized, and people began to become more settled, urbanized, literate, populous, prosperous, all that. Under these conditions, Europe discovered, again, quotes, the Gospels, and this really resulted in a deep spiritual change. They started thinking more, they started being more emotional in their spirituality. And everyone yearned to learn more about Jesus, his mother, and the apostles. And the suffering of humanity became very, very much a part of their spiritual consciousness. So these two pictures are in the time we're talking about, these two paintings. So here's Jesus as a baby, and here's Jesus' mother, really of great interest and fascination to the Christians of this time. And the images of Jesus on the cross changed dramatically. To now we're really emphasizing that this one's particularly bloody, but emphasizing his suffering and his humanity. And he's not a hero. He's not portrayed as a hero. He's portrayed as a suffering human being here on a cross. So again, this discovery of the Gospels and this interest in Jesus as a human and as a suffering human. Okay, so with another thing, with wider literacy and coupled with this new spiritual yearning came the use of personal prayer books. This was something new. And they were called Book of Hours, and some of them were quite lavish for rich people. And these were particularly popular with women, the Book of Hours. And they had in them lots of translations of Gospels, of Psalms, of devotional booklets or writings, and sometimes even sermons of the early church fathers from way back in the early church. Now, Marjorie Kemp wasn't literate. She couldn't read, surprisingly, but she was able to learn a lot about the Bible stories. She found a way. So for one way was that she asked a a particular priest to read to her. And he read her many, many books as priest. So she learned that way. And another way, her main source of learning about the Bible was sermons. And she loved sermons. And in the late Middle Ages, there was an increasing demand for more biblical knowledge, and that resulted in an increase in preaching, especially sermons that spoke to people personally. And Marjorie, I just have to put this in because this is so unusual about her. Marjorie was prone to fits of loud weeping and sobbing when she was deeply moved by these sermons. I mean, really, really loud. And the preachers generally tolerated her loud sobbing, and they just waited for her to quiet down, and then they went on. But on one occasion, she tells a story of how her outbursts annoyed a Franciscan preacher when he was preaching, and so he barred her from his sermons. And I have to read what she said in her autobiography and wonder if any of us would feel this way. She said she felt so much, and she always talks about herself in the third person. So she means Marjorie herself. She felt so much sorrow that she did not know what she could do, for she was excluded from the sermon, which was to her the highest comfort on earth when she could hear it, and equally the greatest pain on earth when she could not hear it. All right, this gospel-centered faith highlighted two special days of the church year, days which particularly focused on the human forgiving Jesus. So in earlier Christianity, the central religious feast had been Easter, which celebrated the risen, glorious, triumphant Christ. Now the faith is emphasizing the suffering of Jesus, so they're really focusing a lot on Good Friday, on the day of the crucifixion. And this is an actual crucifix from the time, or you can see part of it here. And the crucifix in this time became increasingly realistic, so much so that many of us kind of find them grotesque. But for the medieval Christian, they were extremely inspirational. They just for them, the knowledge that Jesus endured this pain for them personally was extremely moving. And I think a lot of this was in reaction to, the way the faith had been lived before. And now it's becoming very, very personal and very intense for them and emotional. Marjorie said again, she said, she came into a fine church where she beheld a crucifix which was piteously portrayed and lamentable to behold. And through beholding of which the passion of our Lord entered into her mind, whereupon she began to melt and utterly dissolve with tears of pity and compassion. They would really spend a lot of time just looking at these crucifixes and just feeling it, as entering into the suffering of Christ. Also, the gospel-centered faith had a new appreciation for Christmas, with its emphasis on Christ's humanity and his vulnerability. And Francis of Assisi, you remember him from a couple of weeks ago, he founded the Franciscan Friars. He created what might have been the first Christmas creche in 1223. And this was to make Jesus' humanity real. And people could see that Jesus had been like them, that he'd been a real baby, things that they hadn't considered so much before. And also Mary grew in huge prominence. So a real baby needed a real mother. And this loving young mother and her beautiful baby were depicted countless times in the visual arts of this time. Marjorie was also deeply moved by the birth story, and she meditated on it so long and so intensely that she imaginatively would enter into the biblical scene. And in one long vision, Marjorie was Mary's maid, like a medieval servant girl who might, do chores or change diapers.
Mm.
A few more characteristics of lay spirituality that are seen in the experience of Marjorie. One of them is pilgrimage. And we've talked about this a little bit before, how important this was, but it was astoundingly popular in this era. And Marjorie was a tireless pilgrim. She started by visiting local shrines in England with her husband. But then in one astounding burst of energy over a 3-year period, and remember, they're traveling on foot and sometimes on boat if they have to cross a waterway, but a lot of this is on foot. So for 3 years, she pilgrimaged, and she went to Assisi in Italy, Rome, Jerusalem, Compostela in Spain, all of that in a 3-year period. And she also went to Norway, Prussia, and Charlemagne's capital in Aachen, Germany. So quite a pilgrim taker was Marjorie. Going on a pilgrimage was dangerous and expensive. And before you went, there was sort of a ritual things that you did before you went, like you settled up all your accounts, paid all your debts, and you'd go to your church in front of your family and friends and neighbors, and there'd be a ceremony, and they would give you the distinctive outfit that a pilgrim would wear. So typically you'd get a broad-brimmed hat. You can see that really clearly in this first picture on the left. You'd get a broad-brimmed hat. You'd get something that's sort of like a knapsack. You'd get a walking staff, and you'd get a mantle or a cape. And pilgrims were very recognizable because they all sort of had this uniform on at this time period. And the idea of pilgrimage to them, for them, it was like this intersection of two theological ideas. One of them was the need to do penance for sins, and the other was the idea of relics. So pilgrimage was considered penitential, or making up for your sins, like fasting, because it required a great sacrifice of time and money. Plus, it was dangerous. Many pilgrims died of disease on the way, or shipwreck, or at the hands of robbers, and some were even taken captive and sold as slaves. But to the medieval pilgrim, all of this risk was worth the reward for them. The other thing that medieval Christians did, and this isn't anything new, we've seen this since the beginning of the Middle Ages, was that they really thought highly of relics, venerated relics. And relics comes from the Latin word relicta, which means left behind. So a relic is something left behind by a deceased saint, either part of his body or some object that's associated with the saint, him or her. So for the people who went on the pilgrimage, they knew that if they prayed to the saints, they'd been taught that if you pray the saints will intercede for you before God. And if you could be in the location where there were some remains of that saint, then that saint's presence would be stronger there, would be there in a very special way for you to pray to them. Okay, so that's pilgrimage, and Marjorie was a pilgrim. And then also concern for the dead was another central feature of late medieval religion, which we mentioned this last week, how the doctrine of purgatory came into being around this time, and it was very much alive. And there, remember all the Black Death and all the dying. The religious imagination of this time was very tuned into this idea of purgatory. So what it meant was that some Christians who had died in God's grace, but they had some unforgiven sin, they were still burdened with that unforgiven sin at death, and they needed to be cleansed of that or purified of that. And so that's what purgatory was. And when you were in purgatory, There was nothing you could do to help yourself. You just had to undergo the cleansing, the purgation, and you could remain there for decades. In the religious imagination of the people, the dead could be in purgatory for decades or centuries or who knows how long. But it was believed that if you prayed for the people in purgatory and did good deeds for them, you could shorten their time of purgation. And Marjorie believed in this, and Marjorie in her book, she talks about how she believes she was chosen as a special intercessor for all in need, including those in purgatory. And she told her scribe, sometimes, I'm quoting, sometimes she would continue weeping for 2 hours and often longer without ceasing, when in mind of our Lord's passion, sometimes for her own sin, sometimes for the sin of others, for other people, sometimes for the souls in purgatory, sometimes for those who were in poverty or any distress, for she wanted to comfort them all. So these are some of the main characteristics of late medieval Catholicism. We also see an intense interest. It might have come through, but we see it already. But I just want to say that there was an intense interest in good works, a huge devotion to Mary, Mother of Jesus, and also, which has been continuing throughout the Middle Ages and even before that, this strong belief and adoration of the Eucharist. I took an entire semester class on medieval spirituality. It is very complex, and I've just given you such a brief summary of, like I said, I studied it for an entire semester and read people from that era. So I just gave you an overview with Marjorie's life. But this great age of faith was a faith ignited by the rediscovery of the Gospels. And it's interesting because we're going to see that when we get to the Reformation, it's going to be a rediscovery of Paul's letters. But we see a rediscovery of the Gospels, an identification with Jesus, Mary, and the saints. And we see especially a desire to see and touch and emotionally experience the truths of the Christian faith. And we saw this through the life of Marjorie. And this, I just wanted to show you before we leave Marjorie. This is a wooden carving at the end of a pew. This is Marjorie at the end of a pew in a church in England. Okay. I want to say a few words about something called Devotio Moderna, which means modern day devotion. And this was a movement with people who were trying to appropriate to their age, which they called modern. For them, it was modern. They wanted to go back to the kind of piety and devotion of Christians from earlier days. And again, this is lay people, and just another way of expressing this desire for more of the spiritual life. So this particular movement, Devotio Moderna, flourished in what is called the Low Countries, which is Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg now. And it was started by a man, this man here, this is an image of Gerard de Groot, and he was born in 1340 in what is the Netherlands. He was orphaned at age 9, and he made his way to Paris as he got older, and he earned a master's degree at the university. And in his mid-20s, he studied law, and then he went to work for a church in Aachen in Germany, and he got paid. It was his job to conduct business for the church, like an administrator of the church, or taking care of the books and that sort of thing. But by the time he was working for the church, but he wasn't a religious, he wasn't a monk or a priest or a bishop or, any of that. He was just a lay person working for the church. But when he was 34, he decided that his life was unclean and in need of a conversion. and he resolved to reorder, and he resigned his job at the church. And he had a nice house, and he gave it to some poor women as a place for them to live together. And these women stayed as part of their churches. They just lived together as lay women in community together. And they call themselves I believe the group gave them this name, the Sisters of the Common Life. And while after he had given his house to these poor women to live in, somebody needs to go on mute. Here's some scratching. After he gave up his house to these poor women, he spent some time as a guest in a monastery. And while he was there, he entered into a reading program. He wanted to really study, and he studied all kinds of religious materials, including the Gospels. Again, focus on the Gospels and everything that you can think of, including the sayings of the Desert Fathers, which are from Egypt, which we talked about in week 2. Eventually, another man opened up his house to male followers of de Groot, and de Groot became their leader. And they were just ordinary men, not monks or religious people, who were going to live together and just be part of the world, but live together in this supportive environment. And de Groot drew up, a way for them to live together, and the schedules for daily tasks and, religious exercises and that sort of thing. But it wasn't at all a monastery or any kind of cloistered religious life. These people were they were going to remain in the world and whatever jobs they had, but they were going to live together under this protection of this newfound community. And they called themselves the Brethren, or the Brothers of the Common Life. And the Devotio Moderna, the way that they approach their spiritual life, stress the search for inner. So it's really about now for these people, inner peace, and a rediscovery of genuine practices of humility and obedience and simplicity of life and inner devotion. They would spend frequent periods meditating on the Gospels, sort of like what Marjorie did, where she'd meditate on stories of Jesus' life and kind of just project themselves into that story and meditate on it. De Groot died suddenly in 1384, when he was 44 years old. He died of the Black Death. You see that, like I said, everything's happening all at the same time here. He died of the Black Death after he had been taking care of a sick person. But the Brothers of the Common Life as a movement really spread. And this community's, or this movement's, most famous member, even more famous than de Groot, was a man by the name of Thomas à Kempis. And he wrote a lot of books, but the most influential book that he wrote, which I'm sure at least some of you have heard of this book, it's called The Imitation of Christ. He wrote it in the 1420s, and this was the handbook for the spiritual life of the Devotio Moderna, or the modern devotion. And I've read that it's perhaps the most widely read devotional work ever besides the Bible, The Imitation of Christ. And apart from the Bible, no book has been translated into more languages. And The Imitation of Christ, and I don't remember the details of it. I do remember a long time ago reading this, but I don't remember it. But it stresses the interior life, again, interior, and becoming a person of peace that is so focused on your inner self and God as to be unmoved by what goes on around you. He actually wrote it as a book that would help both monks and nuns, and also those who remained lay people. And show lay people how to participate in these spiritual disciplines while remaining a layperson. And again, just want to stress that this is new. This kind of devotion, before there had been like a separation. There were the nuns and the monks and the priests and whatever who were very focused on spiritual practices. And then there were the lay people who, worked the fields and went to mass and, did the sacraments through their life. So this concept of lay people having this interior spiritual life of prayer and meditation is new. So according to Thomas in the Imitation of Christ, the disciple imitates Christ by doing the will of others and not one's own will, by possessing less rather than more, by taking the lowest place and regarding oneself as less than others, and desiring and praying for God's will to be perfectly fulfilled in you. And as the disciple descends into herself or himself, she cares less for the things of the world and finds great consolation in the things of God. And this consolation brings peace. And many in this tumultuous time, were hungry for that message. And his writings that spread like wildfire. This, like I said, this book was back then and continued to be for hundreds of years extremely, extremely influential. And the message that he taught in this book really transformed many people. Now, not everyone agreed with his teachings. Some thought it was too world-denying and too self-centered, self-focused, and not enough about the concept of imitating Christ in going outwards and serving and loving others, that sort of imitation of Christ. But again, it might have been imbalanced in that way, but again, it was really, really new. This interiority versus just the external ritual that people had, especially lay people, a huge change for them. Okay, so that's Devotio Moderna. And one more major topic is 14th century mysticism. And I want to do 3 case studies. And I'm starting this with this picture of a woman. And you can see her hair. So she's obviously a lay woman, because religious women, their hair would be either cut off or covered. So this is a lay woman. And she's representative of the 14th century mystic because she's a lay person and she's a woman. Most of the mystics, as I'm going to describe them, were women, although there were definitely men, but the majority were women. And mysticism is can be kind of a creepy word, but really what it means is this concept of living a life of devotion that aims with union with God. And it's very emotional, internal. A lot of it is there are visions. And because of their tendency to map out new experiences of the divine, people often look at them with suspicion and disdain them. But there have been times in history, periods of history, where mysticism has been more prevalent. And it was in this particular time in the 14th century. And I believe that these men and women were needed in their communities of faith at this time, in this tumultuous time. Okay, because in general, the medieval time period, the Middle Ages, are a time of faith. I mean, everybody's, except for Jews, everybody's at least nominally a Christian, and many people are very devout. But it was also becoming increasingly an age of crisis. And I'll just say it again: plague and the decadence of the church, to name a couple of things. And mysticism was perceived as a way of renewing Christianity, and deepening spirituality and strengthening faith. So mysticism, medieval mysticism usually involves sight, visions, and intense emotional experiences. And these mystics saw and felt truth. They saw visions of God and Christ or saints, and they were flooded with love for what they saw. And this was such a powerful experience for them that they felt compelled to share it with others. And there are several writings of mystics that have survived to us. All right, so again, women outnumbered men, but I'm going to share case studies of one man and two women. So first of all, we have a man named by the name of Richard Rolle, R-O-L-L-E, and he lived in England. And he was born in 1300 and lived till 1349. And we don't know a lot about Richard Rolle's life, his early life, except that he seemed to have been born into a small farming family in England. But somebody sponsored him, paid his way to go to study at Oxford, at the University of Oxford. But he quit before he finished his degree, and he became a hermit. And a couple of years after becoming a hermit, he had his first mystical experience. And over his time as a mystic, he wrote several biblical commentaries and devotional works. And his most famous books are, and here's a picture of the two of his most famous books combined in one volume, The Fire of Love and The Mending of Life. And the mending of life is described as an invitation into the life of prayer, and prayer is likened to a journey. And I think for Rolle, that is the key word to think about his mysticism and his spirituality, that the spiritual life is a journey. He describes it as a journey of mystical contemplation and of growing more and more into the life of God and making more and more room for the indwelling presence of God. And in the 1300s and the 1400s, this book was read voraciously by men and women who desired a more profound spiritual life. And they wanted to have that profound experience, that profound spiritual life, not in monasteries or nunneries. They wanted to have it in their ordinary responsibilities. And Rolle's books helped them to find that. So his beginning premise, where he bases his mysticism and his writing on, is that the Christian life is not static, but it's a journey, a movement into intimacy with God. And this is important and kind of new, again, something new at this time, because in this time period throughout Christendom, when you were born into being a Christian, you were baptized as a baby, and that made you a Christian, and you attend to the sacraments, but it's fairly static for the layperson. Even in our times, I think sometimes it's static, because people will, pray some prayer and, pray the right ABC, and then I've got Jesus in my heart, so that's all right. Yeah, I'm a Christian. And then it's kind of this static experience, go to church on Sunday. But with the mystics, we really begin to see this emphasis on a progressive journey into the heart of God. And actually, it's really big in his writing, but all of the medieval mystics have this idea of progressing in the faith. Okay. Yeah, okay. So during the 1400s and the 15th century, like I mentioned, for 100 years up to the time of the Reformation, Richard Rolle was one of the most widely read English writers, spiritual writers, and most of us have never heard of him. I'm sure we wouldn't necessarily resonate with everything in his writings now, all these centuries later, but he's actually someone that I haven't read, but would actually, that's not true. That's not true. I did read a little bit by him. all of these mystics, all of these writers have something interesting for us today. All right, so that's Richard Roll. The next, we're going to move to a female mystic from Italy named Catherine of Siena. She lived from 1347 to 1380. She only lived to the age of 33. And so she lived in Italy, and between the Black Death was actually started in Italy. It was terrible there. And Italy was in such a state of chaos because the papacy had left there and gone to Avignon. So she grew up in a place that was all of Europe was tumultuous, but Italy was just particularly hit hard during the 14th century. So that's where she grew up. And she was listen to this. You thought Marjorie had a lot of children. Catherine was the 24th of 25 children in a poor but devout Catholic family. At 7 years old, she vowed her virginity to God. And I'm wondering if that had anything to do with watching her mother. But she vowed her divinity at 7 years old. And at 15, she cut her hair. She cut her hair off in defiance of her parents who were trying to get her married. And then at 18, she associated herself with the Dominicans. And she didn't become a religious. She became part of something called the Third Order. So the first order would be monks, the second order would be nuns, and the third order would be men or women who just wanted to sort of associate with the order, but they didn't take vows. They could be married, live at home. They may or may not wear distinctive clothing, but they just kind of wanted to be close. So they were part of what's called the Third Order, and that was Catherine. She lived, so she joined the Third Order of the Dominicans, but she lived with her family at home. But she kind of kept to herself. I don't know where she found room with 25 kids to have any solitude and silence, but she separated herself for most of the time and only came out to go to Mass. And in the third year of her religious life like this, she had a vision. This is a painting of it. That she had a vision that Jesus declared to Catherine, "I marry you in faith." So after this mystical marriage, she felt called to leave her cloistered, homebound state in her family home to go out into the world and to serve the world actively. I think this is fascinating. So she remained a contemplative all her life, and she had what she called an interior cell of self-knowledge and contemplation and prayer. But she combined that contemplative life with a life of service. I've got an image over here of service to the poor and the sick in her local community. So lots of service to the poor and sick, and also political activism. She was very much involved in the political affairs, especially of the church at the time. And this was at the time when the papacy was over there in France. So her putting together of these vocations of, the mystical, contemplative, and service and activism, that really caught people's eye and attracted many of her contemporaries, both men and women, who wanted that same kind of life of contemplation and deep spirituality, internal spirituality, and service and activism. And many people joined her work. So Catherine got right into the center of religious and political issues of her time. And again, the most pressing thing for the people of Italy, and actually the people of Europe, and we talked about this a lot last week, was the the Pope the Pope having deserted Rome and gone over to Avignon, France. And that had caused a lot of chaos and trouble for Italy, conflict. But she had an influence on Pope Gregory XI, who was over there in Avignon, and she wrote him letters and had a great influence on convincing him to come back to Italy, come back to Rome in 1377. And we talked about him last week. Catherine wrote 400 letters, 26 prayers, and a magnificent work called The Dialogue. And in this book, The Dialogue, it's a dialogue between a soul who asks the Lord 4 questions, and the Lord himself replies. And it teaches the reader about love and suffering and desire and union with God. Catherine died when she was only 33. She had a massive stroke, but she was an extraordinary woman of the Middle Ages. First of all, because she participated in male-dominated politics and religious conflicts. Her unrelenting work at the same time with the poor and suffering in her own community, and the depth of her writings and their subsequent centuries of influence on Christian devotion. And all of this as a lay woman. Okay. Our third mystic and last case study of the late Middle Ages is a woman from a medieval English town called Norwich. This is a church in Norwich, England, and it's a parish church known as the Church of St. Julian. And this is the back of the church. And you can see over there on the left, this is one of those little cells built onto the side of a church, an anchorite cell. And remember the anchoress, it was either a woman or a man who made vows to live their lives in solitude and prayer in this little cell attached to the side of a church. That's what this is in this church in Norwich. And it's interesting because they made these vows to live in solitude and they stayed in their cell, but they were doing this in cities and towns. They weren't, isolated, and people could actually make pilgrimages to go visit the anchoress and get spiritual advice from them. So the anchoress who lived here in this cell at the Church of St. Julian in Norwich in the late 1300s to 1416 is known as Julian of Norwich. We don't even know her real name. But people traveled for miles to see her. And she was a famous spiritual advisor in her day. Even Marjorie Kemp, the woman that we talked about at the beginning, in her pilgrimages around England, because Marjorie and Julian both lived in England. So people traveled, like I said, miles to see her, including Marjorie Kemp. And Marjorie actually visited Julian when Julian was about 70 years old, living in her anchoress cell. And according to Marjorie in her book, Julian gave her some wonderful spiritual advice. And Julian of Norwich is known to posterity as one of the greatest spiritual writers in Christian history. And her fame rests on one single book, and it's written in a shorter version and a longer version. It's called The Revelations of Divine Love. Julian was a lay person. She might have been single or she might have been widowed, but she lived in a family home. She was another lay person. And Julian tells us in her book that when she was 30 years old, she prayed for a serious illness. And she wanted that as a means to be purged by the mercy of God, and afterwards to live more to the glory of God after the illness. And she did become seriously ill, and to the point of death. And after she had received the last rites, and remember, that's one of the 7 sacraments where the priest would, I'm not sure exactly what they do, but it's a rite that is given by a priest when a person is about to die. After she'd received that last rite sacrament, she, over the next several hours, she had a series of 15 visions. And then the following night, she had a 16th vision. She completely recovered from her illness, and she wrote down her visions. And that's the shorter text where she wrote down what she saw. And later in life, she began a theological exploration of the meaning of her visions. And that's now known as the longer text. And she worked on this theological exploration of what these visions meant for like 20 or 30 years. And she wrote not in Latin, but she wrote in English. And this book, The Revelations of Divine Love, is the first writer in English that can be definitely identified as a woman. So this is the first that we actually can identify and have of English writing by a woman. And in later life, she wasn't an anchoress her whole life, but in later life, she decided to shut herself up in that cell, and she continued to work on her reflections, and again, to give spiritual advice to people. She developed from a visionary into the most remarkable theologian of her time. She wrote, "Just because I am a woman, must I therefore believe that I must not tell you about the goodness of God?" And her writing is radical in some ways, because it draws out, it looks at the Jesus sacrificial life and death and the love that is shown in that, and draws that out to the implications of what does that say about the character of God? What does that say about the nature of God? And she refers to Jesus sometimes as mother. And she's not the first one who ever did that. And it's not like she rejected masculine language, but she also used feminine type language and the word mother as a dramatic way of highlighting Jesus's nurturing love as central to God's character, that nurturing love. One of her most memorable metaphors is that of a little nut. She said, in one of her visions, she saw the whole universe is a little thing like a nut held in the protecting and nurturing hand of God. And I first encountered Julian's writings about 4 years ago in that class that I took on medieval spirituality. This is my copy of it here. I've read it 3 times. I've gone through this 3 times, and I'm sure I'm going to read it again. There's no end to the depth in her theological reflections and this Revelations of Divine Love. She's so thoroughly medieval, truly, but somehow or other she transcends the piety of her own day with her presentation of the heart of the Christian faith. And she gives these lurid descriptions of her visions of seeing Jesus' discolored body on the cross. And she moves from that to an understanding that the ultimate truth about the universe is the self-giving, self-forgiving love of Jesus. I'm just going to see if there's what's in this chat here. Oh yeah, there's a gorgeous poem by Denise Levertov on Julian called The Showings. That's another thing that some books, some translations of her book are called The Showings of Divine Love. Thanks for reminding me of that, Emily. Emily's the poet among us. Anyways, I just want to close up with Julian with a quote from, let's get back on this screen, a quote from Vision 13. I just want to read this. So this is part of her reflecting on Vision 13. "After this, our Lord reminded me of the longing I had for him, And I saw that nothing kept me from him but sin. And I saw this as so with all of us. And I thought that if sin had never existed, we should all have been pure and like himself, as God made us. And so I had often wondered before now in my folly, why, in his great foreseeing wisdom, God had not prevented the beginning of sin. For then I thought all would have been well. I ought certainly to have abandoned these thoughts, but nevertheless, I grieved and sorrowed over the question with no reason or judgment. But Jesus, who in this vision informed me of all that I needed to know, answered me with this assurance: sin is befitting, sin is there, but all shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. And we can all go home now. All right. Okay, this is our summary matrix. I filled it out already for the late Middle Ages because we're done with the Middle Ages tonight. So just a quick summary of issues. So we have the papal corruption and the schism, where you have 2 and sometimes 3 popes. Huge socioeconomic and socio-political changes, the Black Plague, urbanization, this growing middle class, nationalism, and the forming of the more modern countries kind of thing. Dissent, we saw with Huss and Wycliffe. We saw in terms of worship and spirituality, this in this period, this intense quest for a deeper spiritual life on the part of lay people. We saw mysticism, and we saw the rediscovery of the Gospels and the focus on the humanity and suffering of Jesus. In terms of social, political things, we saw a great growth in education, including women, and increased translation into the languages of the people. We saw a little bit about of Renaissance humanism and the discovery of the New World. So I just want to take note of the fact that the Middle Ages covered 1,000 years, and that's half of the history almost half of the history of the Christian church, of Christianity, was the Middle Ages. Some of it was terrible and some of it was beautiful. And I just want to say that hopefully I've been given a balanced picture of the terrible and the beautiful. Our image of the Middle Ages has been colored by 2 things. One of them is the Reformation, and Reformation teaching and preaching really painted the Middle Ages very dark, very bad, because they wanted to justify the kind of radical change that they wanted. So they've written history about the Middle Ages in very, very negative ways, and we're the heirs of that. And also we're the heirs of the Enlightenment of the 16th century, where reason was exalted above everything, and faith and religion and revelation and religious rituals, that sort of thing, was all, just called superstition. So we're also, we also have that in our heads. So both of those things tend to color how we view the Middle Ages. But I'm hoping that, you're coming away with this with a different picture of the Middle Ages, that it wasn't all terrible, like no age is all terrible, and that somehow maybe we can appropriate some of the beauty that we as Protestants sort of left behind with the Protestant Reformation, particularly in terms of spirituality. Next week, no class, spring break. Nobody go to Florida, please. Whoops, sorry, somebody's already down there, Katie. So we'll have next week off. When we come back, we're going to do the Protestant Reformation in the same format that we've been doing it. And then starting on the 20th through June 22nd, we're going to have 9 weeks where we're going to do the history of Christianity in the United States. And we're going to also look at it through, we're going to just do the just sort of textbook kind of history of the United States. of Christianity in the United States. And also we're going to take a look at it also through the lens of race. And this is my plan here. So we're going to talk about, for instance, in our first class, we're going to talk about the colonial beginnings in the 1600s and, everything that happened there. And then we'll take a look at that same time period through the lens of race, and do that through all of the time periods of our Christian history in the United States.